Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. It was Matt's history, raw and dangerous and buried so deeply that Jack could nearly feel the times clawing their way back to the face as he opened it, his jaw tensing with every runner, his breath growing shallow as the verity unfolded in brutal, implacable detail, revealing that Matt, quiet, guarded, putatively pious Matt, had formerly lived a life so integrated with Jack's own family that the counter-accusations made his head spin. Because according to the documents, letters, and a faded handwritten concession put away between medical records and sealed court lines, Matt hadn't just crossed paths with the Abbotts times agone. He'd been part of them, used by them, discarded by them, and also forced to vanish, and the shock of it hit Jack like a physical blow when he realized that Matt had been present on the night of the ignominious auto accident decades before, the bone. Something had been forgotten by the public. It still bothered Jack with feelings of guilt and unanswered questions from a long time ago. This was about a woman who had made a mistake and a cover-up had protected the Abbott name. It had ruined someone else's whole life. Because as the truth came out, Matt had been the driver who was forced to be behind the wheel due to pressure and problems. The situation had been really tough for Matt. It had been a big deal for the Abbott name, but it had been a disaster for someone else. Jack could not forget that the Abbott name had been saved. At what cost, and it still made him think about what had happened to that other person. The memory of it still haunted Jack. He often thought about the woman who had failed and the cover-up that had saved the Abbott name, but had changed someone else's life forever. Promises that were no way kept, a youthful man hopeless for blessing, for plutocrat, for a way out of a life formerly piled against him, and Jack's hands began to shake as he read Matt's own words describing how he'd been told the Abbotts would cover him, how John Abbott himself had interposed, not out of atrocity but out of fear, fear for his family, fear for the conglomerate he'd erected, sweat that one reproach would destroy everything, and so Matt had been paid, silenced, and pushed into a new identity, his felonious record altered, his name buried, his trauma ignored, and Jack felt his casket strain as the consummation actualized that while he'd grown up with honor, miscalculations gentled by wealth and remission, Matt had been forced to carry the blame alone, ingrained dangerous, unstable, disposable. And the wrathfulness that surged through Jack wasn't just toward his father or the system, or the cruel math of power. It was toward himself for no way asking the right questions, for no way noticing the cracks, for no way imagining that someone standing so near to him now had formerly been offered so fully for the Abbott heritage. And as he kept reading, the verity only grew darker, because the train detailed how Matt had latterly been signed by shadowy commercial rivals to asset on Jabot, not because he was greedy, but because they knew who he was, what he owed, what secrets he carried, and they had used his history like a armament, swinging exposure over his head, hanging to destroy what little stability he'd rebuilt. And Jack slammed the brochure shut for a moment, pacing the room as recollections rearranged themselves in his mind, exchanges with Matt suddenly taking on new meaning, the guarded aesthetics, the flashes of resentment snappily masked by professionalism, the way Matt always sounded to know too important and yet said so little. And when Jack eventually forced himself to read the final runners, his heart sank indeed further, because Matt's secret wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what was coming, a warning written times agone, and no way transferred, explaining that if the verity ever surfaced, it wouldn't just blemish reports, it would tear families piecemeal, drag old adversaries back into the open, and conceivably bring lives, because there were people who would do anything to keep the once buried, people who had formerly proven they were willing to manipulate, hang, and destroy. And Jack felt the weight of leadership settle heavily on his shoulders as he realized that this wasn't just a moral reckoning. It was a ticking time lemon, one that involved Victor Newman's long memory, Adam's gift for chaos, and a web of alliances and grievances stretching back decades. And as the office door creaked vocally behind him, Jack didn't need to turn around to know someone was there, because the pressure in the air shifted, thick and electric, and when he eventually faced Matt, standing there with a look that was equal corridor defiance and prostration, Jack understood that this battle had been ineluctable, that secrets like this could no way stay buried ever, and in that long, Charged silence. Jack saw not an adversary but a survivor, someone who had paid for the sins of important men, and when he eventually spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, admitting that he knew now, that he was sorry, that he could undo the history, but he wouldn't allow it to be used as influence ever again. Matt's countenance cracked just enough to reveal the times of wrathfulness and pain beneath, and he confessed that he hadn't wanted vengeance, not at first, that all he'd wanted was acknowledgement, verity, a chance to stop running from a shadow that had followed him his entire life. And Jack realized that the real shock wasn't just the secret itself, it was what it demanded of him now, because doing the right thing might mean exposing the Abbott family, risking Jabot, and standing up to forces that thrived on secretiveness and fear. But as he looked at Matt, Jack knew that the cycle had to end nearly, and if it didn't end with him, it no way would. And so the disclosure of Matt's history didn't just change how Jack saw the man standing before him, it changed how he saw himself, his family, and the heritage he wanted to leave before, setting the stage for a reckoning in Genoa City that would ripple through every alliance, every contest, and every precisely constructed taradiddle, proving formally again that in the young and the restless, the history is no way truly, once it's just staying for the right moment to explode. The shock didn't fade with the first battle. Rather, it strengthened, spreading through Jack's studies like essay in water, staining every memory and supposition he'd ever made, because formerly a secret like Matt's is exposed, it refuses to stay contained. And as the hours passed, Jack set up himself replaying decades of Abbott history through a new, merciless lens, seeing not just success and adaptability, but the collateral damage left before in the name of survival, and that consummation eroded at him as he sat across from Matt Latterly that night, the megacity quiet outdoors, the hum of the structure nearly accusatory, because Jack knew that admitting the verity was only the first step and far from the hardest one, since the train also revealed that the cover-up had involved further people than he'd imagined, including legal interposers, croakers, who falsified reports, and indeed a private investigator who latterly dissolved under mysterious circumstances, and the recrimination was chilling. The secret had formerly killed reports, careers, and conceivably lives, and if it came out now, it could enkindle a disagreement that Genoa City wasn't prepared for, especially with Victor Newman always lurking in the background, a man who collected secrets the way others collected glories, and Jack couldn't shake the fear that Victor formerly knew corridor of the story, and was simply staying for the perfect moment to strike, because Victor no way wasted influence, and Matt's history was influence of the loftiest order, and as Jack scuffled with that study, he noticed how Matt's posture no way completely relaxed, how times of living under trouble had trained him to anticipate treason indeed in moments of apparent understanding, and that consummation hit Jack harder than any blameworthiness could, because it forced him to defy how deeply the Abbot's opinions had shaped another man's entire actuality, pushing him into corners where trust was a liability and silence was survival. And Jack set up himself making a pledge audibly, one that surprised indeed him, that he'd cover Matt now, not because of guilt or fear of exposure, but because it was the right thing to do, and yet indeed as he said the words he understood the cost. Because protection in Genoa City was no way simple, it meant choosing sides, drawing lines, and occasionally going to war, and the veritably coming morning those consequences began to materialize when a cryptic communication appeared on Jack's phone, a single judgment that made his blood run cold. Some histories are better left buried, and signed but unmistakably hanging, and Jack didn't need a hand to know that the timepiece had started ticking, because someone differently had tasted the shift, the disturbance in a long-settled taradiddle, and was moving to contain it. And as he stood in the Jabot boardroom hours latterly, contending routine questions from directors who had no idea how close the company was to crumpling, Jack realized that leadership wasn't just about gains and power. It was about deciding who paid the price when the verity demanded to be told, and that weight bore down on him as Ashley and Kyle began to notice his distraction, their concern growing with every cropped response and absent regard. And when Ashley eventually brazened him intimately, demanding honesty as only a family could, Jack dithered, because he knew that once he let her in there would be no turning back. But the memory of Matt's haunted eyes pushed him forward, and he told her everything, Every unattractive detail, every compromised choice, and Ashley's response was wrathfulness at first but unbelief. Also anguish. Also a slow, burning fury directed not just at their father, but at the culture of secretiveness that had allowed such a thing to be, and she advised Jack that if this came out it would just rewrite Abbott history. It would fracture the family each over again, continuing injuries that had slightly healed, and Jack knew she was right, because secrets had always been the Abbotts' curse as much as their guard. And meanwhile Matt set up himself under adding pressure from all sides, anonymous calls reminding him of debts long paid, veiled pitfalls about people he watched about now, subtle warnings that his fragile peace could be destroyed with a single disclosure, and the old instinct to run resurfaced, stronger than ever, tempting him to vanish formally further and spare everyone the fallout. But commodity had changed, because for the first time someone important was standing beside him rather than over him, and that made the fear harder to justify, indeed as it remained sorrowfully real. And when Victor eventually summoned Jack to a private meeting, the pressure was palpable, because Victor spoke in mysteries as he always did, intimating at old miscalculations and fidelity tested by time, no way naming Matt directly, but circling the subject with raptorial perfection, and Jack realized that Victor was probing, trying to see how important Jack knew and how far he was willing to go. And in that moment Jack made a choice that would define everything that followed, because rather of diverting or denying, he met Victor's aspect, and made it clear that he'd no longer allow the history to be used as an armament, that whatever secrets would be dealt with openly if necessary, and Victor's thin smile told Jack that the game had just escalated, because Victor admired strength but no way forgave defiance, and as whispers began to ripple through Genoa City, rumors of sealed lines being restarted, of old substantiations being communicated, of intelligencers suddenly smelling around forgotten incidents, Jack understood that the reckoning was no longer academic, it was ineluctable, and the only question left was whether he'd control the narrative or be crushed by it. And as Matt watched this storm gather, he scuffled with his own disagreeing solicitations, the appetite to eventually tell his story colliding with the terror of what exposure would bring, because while verity could be liberating, it could also be destructive. And he stressed that formerly unleashed it would consume not just the Abbotts but himself as well, reducing him formally again to an exemplary tale, a citation in someone differently saga, and yet the longer the secret rotted, the more he felt it poisoning everything around him. And when a journalist eventually approached him directly, fortified with just enough information to be dangerous, Matt knew that silence was no longer a guard, it was a liability. And he turned to Jack not with demands but with a simple, ruinous question: if the verity comes out, will you still stand with me, indeed when it costs you everything? And Jack didn't answer incontinently, because the honest answer was intimidating, but when he eventually spoke it was with a clarity that surprised them both, because he said yes, knowing sharp well that this choice might strike the conglomerate his family had erected, alienate betters, and hand adversaries exactly what they wanted, but also knowing that anything lower would mean repeating the same injustice that had visited Matt for decades. And as the story edged closer to the face, alliances shifted, old adversaries tasted occasion, and Genoa City braced itself for another seismic disclosure, one that hovered to review icons and villains likewise, because in the young and the restless, redemption is no way clean, remission is no way guaranteed, and the once no way stays buried, without demanding its due. And Jack's shock at Matt's secret eventually came commodity, far more important and dangerous, a catalyst for verity, responsibility, and a reckoning that would test not just one man's heart, but the very soul of the Abbott heritage. The fallout began, still and quiet like the calm before a storm. Jack could feel it in the way people looked at him, the way they broke when they talked, and the way they left effects unsaid. It was like everyone in Genoa City was staying for commodity to be. Matt was right in the middle of it. He'd spent his life trying to avoid this, but now he was face to face with it. The questions from the intelligencer were getting sharper. The warnings were getting more serious. A slashed tire, a note on his door. It was clear that someone was trying to keep a secret buried, no matter what it took. Jack was determined to do commodity about it. That made him take some big pitfalls. He indeed hired a platoon of attorneys to look at the secret documents and get ready for everything to come out. This move transferred shockwaves through the megacity because it looked like the Abbotts might actually be willing to tell the verity about themselves indeed if it hurt. Ashley was torn between being pious to her family and doing what was right. She started talking to people who had been silenced ahead. She set up some heartbreaking stories that sounded a lot like Matt's. Each bone of these stories showed that this wasn't one insulated incident, but part of a bigger pattern of fear and pride. As these stories came out, Jack felt the weight of what he was trying to do. He realized that fixing this wasn't about one problem or one reason, but about breaking a long history of silence that had defended power at the expenditure of people. Meanwhile, Victor was watching everything precisely. He started to make his moves. He gave the press some information, but not too important. He tried to make himself look like an observer who might be suitable to help. Jack knew that if Victor controlled the story, the verity would get twisted and used as an armament of a way to heal. So Jack made a decision. He'd tell his story on his own terms. He blazoned that he'd be making a statement about some problems connected to the Abbott family, and that got everyone's attention. The media went crazy. Matt was shocked. The thing he'd been hysterical of for decades was eventually passing. It wasn't passing by whispers. It was passing in the limelight. Yet indeed, with all the fear, Matt felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of keeping secrets was starting to lift. He felt like he was eventually taking control of his story. When the day came for Jack to make his statement, he stood in front of the cameras, his voice steady, but full of emotion. He said that the Abbott family had made some choices that hurt people and that those people merited the verity and justice. The response was immediate and strong, with some people praising Jack's courage and others demanding consequences. As the story came out, Matt's face was far and wide, on television, in the papers, and online. But he wasn't portrayed as a villain. He was shown as a man who had been wronged by people important than him. The attention was hard to take. It also brought some unanticipated support. People started to come who had analogous stories of dealing with power and injustice. As the legal battles started and old injuries were restarted, Jack plotted with the cost of doing the thing. He watched as the company's stock prices fell, as connections ended, and as his family plotted with the verity about their fathers once. Indeed, in the midst of all the chaos, there were some moments of real reckoning. People started to talk and apologize, not to save face, but because they really felt shamefaced. Matt saw some of these moments be behind doors, and he felt like he was eventually taking back control of his life. He realized that no quantum of plutocrat or silence could ever give him what he really wanted: the verity and justice. Indeed, though the future was still uncertain, one thing was clear. The secret that had defined Matt's life for so long no longer had power over him. Jack, standing amid the consequences of his choice, understood that shock had been the catalyst, but integrity was the heritage he was now fighting to make, proving formally again that in the young and the restless, the most dangerous secrets aren't the bones revealed, but the bones left to corruption in silence. In the fate, when the cameras eventually pulled back and the captions moved on to the coming reproach, the true consequences of the disclosure began to settle into the quiet spaces where no public statement could reach, and Jack set up himself walking through the Abbott manse late at night, girdled by recollections that now felt heavier, more complicated, because every success etched into those walls carried an echo of the price someone differently had paid, and yet for the first time in times he didn't feel the need to run from that verity, because facing it had stripped down the vision that guarding a name was the same as guarding people. And across city, Matt sat alone in his apartment, the noise of public judgment eventually fading into a strange, fragile calm. Apprehensive that his life would no way return to what it had been, but also realizing that he no longer had to hide from his own reflection, because his story was eventually his to tell. And when Jack reached out to him, not as a donator or a shamefaced heir at law, but as a man seeking genuine conciliation, there was no grand speech, no dramatic gesture, just an acknowledgement of participated humanity and a pledge to move forward without secrets. And in that understated moment, both men understood that while the history could no way be cancelled, It could be converted into commodity that no longer poisoned the present, setting a quieter, more honest chapter in stir. One where responsibility replaced silence, and where the shock of verity came the first step toward lasting change in Genoa City.